the written word was very important because it was, you got all those books, the Bible, you've got the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with. Half the time, they didn't even need to read the subtitles. They could look at it and know what was going on.
High in the sun-scorched peaks of Ethiopia, ancient monks guard a secret that Rome couldn't touch. While the world follows a 66-book Bible, a hidden 81-book canon has sat in silence for 1,500 years. Now, Mel Gibson is pulling back the curtain on a version of Jesus that feels different, rawer, more powerful. We're talking about the Watchers, the Nephilim, and a Messiah the history books tried to edit. Are you ready to see the uncensored gospel? The Passion Director, looking to Ethiopia. Mel Gibson isn't just an actor or a director. He's a man who has spent decades trying to strip away the Sunday school polish of Western Christianity to find the grit, the blood, and the raw, supernatural reality underneath. Remember the Passion of the Christ? People called it too violent, too visceral, and too intense. But Mel's response was always the same. He wanted to show the reality that history tried to soften. He wanted the Aramaic. He wanted the Latin. He wanted the dirt under the fingernails. Now, rumors and insiders suggest that Gibson's gaze has shifted away from the Roman archives and toward the Horn of Africa. Why? Because the Western world's Bible is, in many ways, an edited director's cut, sanctioned by emperors and committees. But in the isolated, cloud-covered monasteries of Ethiopia, there exists a version of the story that hasn't changed since the 4th century. It's a version that contains 15 more books than the one sitting on your nightstand. Think about that for a second. We've all been raised with a 66-book canon, the standard version. But what if the most explosive chapters were left on the cutting room floor? Gibson, a filmmaker known for his truth-at-all-costs mentality, seems to realize that if you want the full picture of who Jesus was, you can't just look at what survived the European printing press. You have to look at what was preserved by the oldest Christian nation on earth, a nation that claims to hold the physical Ark of the Covenant and a spiritual lineage that predates the Vatican. Gibson has always been a traditionalist Catholic, a man who often finds himself at odds with the modern bureaucracy of the Church. His interest in the Ethiopian Bible isn't just about curiosity. It's about a search for the original source code. He's looking for the version of the Messiah that wasn't smoothed over by the Council of Nicaea or simplified for 21st century sensibilities. He's looking for the Jesus who lived in a world where fallen angels walked the earth, where giants were a historical reality, and where the spiritual war wasn't a metaphor, it was a daily battle. When you see a figure like Gibson, someone with the resources to produce global epics, diving into the Ethiopic texts, it signals a massive shift in the cultural zeitgeist. It means the lost Gospels are no longer just for dusty academics in Ivy League basements. They are becoming the centerpiece of a new understanding of our history. This isn't just about religion. It's about a cinematic search for the ultimate truth. If the Western Bible is the standard edition, Mel Gibson is betting that Ethiopia holds the ultimate uncut version. And as we're about to see, the differences aren't just minor typos, they are cosmic. To grasp the weight of these books, we first have to ask, how did they survive while the rest of the world's oldest texts burned? The Garima Gospels, older than we imagined. When we talk about the Ethiopian Bible, we aren't just talking about a different table of contents. We are talking about physical, tangible artifacts that defy the laws of time. For decades, Western scholars were, frankly, a bit dismissive. They looked at the brightly colored illustrations and the remarkably preserved vellum of the Ethiopian manuscripts and assumed they were late copies, perhaps from the 11th or 12th centuries. They figured nothing that beautiful could have survived the humidity and the political upheavals of Africa for longer than a few hundred years. They were wrong, dead wrong. In 2010, carbon dating results sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. The Abba Garima Gospels, kept in a remote monastery in the Tigray highlands, were dated to between 330 and 650 AD. To put that in perspective, these are likely the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts in existence. They were written and bound while the Roman Empire was still gasping its final breaths. While Europe was entering the Dark Ages, Ethiopian scribes were meticulously preserving a version of the life of Christ that was already centuries old. The legend says that Abba Garima, one of the 9 saints who came to Ethiopia from the Byzantine Empire, arrived at the monastery and wrote the entire gospel in a single day. The story goes that God delayed the setting of the sun until the saint could finish his work. Whether you believe the miracle or not, the physical evidence is undeniable. These books exist. They are ancient, and they haven't been updated by a committee in over 1,600 years. This is what fascinates truth seekers like Gibson. In the West, we have critical editions of the Bible, versions where scholars compare thousands of scraps of papyrus to guess what the original might have said. But in Ethiopia, you don't have to guess. You have a continuous, unbroken tradition preserved by a geographic fortress. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church didn't need to rediscover these texts. They never lost them. The isolation of the Ethiopian highlands acted like a spiritual time capsule. Because the country was never colonized in the same way its neighbors were, and because its rugged terrain made it nearly impossible for invading armies to reach these mountaintop monasteries, the censors of the outside world never got their hands on these pages. While the Roman Church was busy deciding which books were canonical and which were heretical to maintain political unity, the Ethiopian monks were simply copying what they had been given by the apostles themselves. The result is a library of faith that feels like an alternate reality. The Garima Gospels aren't just books. They are survivors of a lost world. They prove that the Christian story didn't just travel north into Europe, it traveled south, deep into the heart of Africa. And it took root in a way that preserved a much more ancient, much more mystical flavor of the faith. If the physical books are this ancient, what exactly is written inside them that the rest of the world was taught to forget? The missing 21. What the King James Version left out. If you open a standard King James Bible, you'll find 66 books. If you're Catholic, you'll find 73. But the Ethiopian Bible stands alone with 81 books. That is a massive discrepancy. We're talking about 15 to 21 entire books of wisdom, prophecy, and history that the Western world essentially deleted. Why the difference? In the early centuries of the Church, there wasn't a single master copy of the Bible. Different regions had different collections of holy texts. However, as the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, they wanted a universal, Catholic version. At councils like the Council of Rome and the Council of Hippo, bishops voted on which books were divinely inspired and which were apocryphal, a word that basically means hidden or doubtful. The books that didn't make the cut weren't necessarily considered fake. Many were simply deemed too weird, too controversial, or not useful for church discipline. But the Ethiopians didn't care about Roman politics. They didn't attend those councils. They held on to everything. Among these missing 21 are titles that sound like something out of a fantasy epic: the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Maccabean. To the Ethiopian Church, these aren't extra books, they are essential. They provide the context for why Jesus came in the first place. Take the Book of Jubilees, for example. It's often called the Little Genesis. It covers the same ground as the first book of our Bible, but adds incredible detail. It explains the exact divisions of time, the secret history of the patriarchs, and even mentions the 22 things God created on the first day. It fills in the plot holes that have frustrated Bible students for centuries. Then there are the Maccabean, not to be confused with the Catholic books of Maccabees. These books tell the stories of martyrs who stood against pagan kings with a level of grit and defiance that matches the tone of a Mel Gibson film. They are stories of intense faith under fire, written with a visceral energy that makes the standard Sunday school lessons feel watered down. By removing these books, the Western Church effectively streamlined the faith. They made it easier to manage, easier to teach, and arguably easier to control. But in doing so, they lost the atmosphere of the ancient world. They turned a sprawling, cosmic library into a handbook. The Ethiopian Bible reminds us that the original Christian experience was much more expansive, much more mysterious, and much more cluttered with supernatural detail than we were ever led to believe. And of all these deleted chapters, there is one book in particular that changes the entire backstory of the human race, and it begins with the stars falling from the sky. The Watchers and the Nephilim, the Book of Enoch. When people talk about the secrets of the Ethiopian Bible, the conversation almost always starts and ends with one name: Enoch. In the Western world, Enoch is a mere footnote, a mysterious figure in the book of Genesis who walked with God and was no more. He is the man who skipped death, disappearing into the heavens. Yet the Bible most of us grew up with tells us almost nothing about why he was chosen for such a destiny. But in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the Book of Enoch is not a lost book or a piece of apocrypha. It is a foundational pillar of their Holy Scripture. It is fully canon, and once you actually sit down and read it, you immediately realize why the early Roman authorities and later Western councils might have wanted it buried deep in the earth. The Book of Enoch provides the dark, cinematic prequel to the Great Flood that the Standard Bible essentially glosses over in a few verses. It pulls back the curtain on a period of human history that looks less like a Sunday school felt board and more like a high-stakes sci-fi epic. It tells the story of the Watchers, a group of 200 high-ranking angels, celestial beings of immense power who looked down from the heavens at the daughters of men and were consumed by a forbidden desire. Led by a figure named Semyaza, these angels didn't just make a mistake, they made a pact. They descended onto Mount Hermon with a plan to defect from the divine order and interbreed with humanity. The offspring of these forbidden unions were the Nephilim, monstrous giants that, according to the text, ravaged the earth. These weren't just tall men, they were biological anomalies that consumed the resources of the world until humanity could no longer survive their presence. But the corruption didn't stop at biology. Enoch describes these fallen angels teaching humanity forbidden secrets that we weren't spiritually ready for. They taught the art of metallurgy for the creation of swords and weapons of war. They taught the compounding of poisons and the secrets of enchantment. They even taught the beautifying of the eyelids through cosmetics and the study of the stars through astrology. In the Ethiopian worldview, the sin that led to the flood wasn't just general human wickedness. It was a systemic, technological, and spiritual corruption of the human race by external, multidimensional forces. This is where the Gibson-esque grit comes in. Imagine a movie directed by Mel Gibson based on the Book of Enoch. It wouldn't be a story of harps and clouds. It would be a dark, visceral, and terrifying epic of a world spinning out of control under the thumb of ancient celestial tyrants. It describes a world where the line between the physical and the supernatural has been completely erased. And the most shocking part for many Western Christians is this: the New Testament writers, the very men who wrote the Gospels and the Epistles, actually quoted the Book of Enoch as authoritative scripture. The Book of Jude quotes Enoch directly, word for word. Peter references the spirits in prison from Enoch's timeline. The early church fathers like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexandria all treated it as holy and divinely inspired. So, why was it deleted from the Western Bible? Some scholars argue it was because the descriptions of angels having physical reproductive bodies were too scandalous for later Greek-influenced theologians who wanted to keep the spiritual realm strictly abstract and separate from the material. Others suggest it was simply too apocalyptic and politically dangerous. A book that describes the overthrow of celestial tyrants might give the peasants wrong ideas about their earthly kings. But Ethiopia, isolated by its mountains and its fierce independence, never cared about Roman theological hygiene or European political control. They kept Enoch because they believed it was the truth, preserved by the ancestors. By keeping this book, the Ethiopian Bible gives us a version of Jesus who isn't just a moral teacher or a local reformer, but a cosmic liberator. When the Jesus of the Ethiopian Bible speaks about judging the fallen angels or binding the strong man, the Ethiopian reader isn't confused by metaphors. They know exactly which angels he's talking about. They have the names. They have the history. They have the intelligence report on the enemy that the rest of the world threw in the trash. It changes the stakes of the entire New Testament from a local religious dispute in Judea to a universe-spanning rescue mission. It's a story of a Messiah coming to reclaim a world that had been hijacked by ancient dark intelligences. This is the hidden side of the story that turns a religious text into a cosmic war manual. But the supernatural elements don't stop with the ancient past. They follow the Messiah into his very first years on this earth, revealing a side of the boy Jesus that would shock most modern believers. The childhood of a god, the infancy gospel of Thomas. When we think of the childhood of Jesus in the Western tradition, we usually get a massive time jump. We see the nativity, the manger, the shepherds, the star, and then we suddenly skip 18 years to his baptism in the Jordan River. The only bridge we have is a single story in the Gospel of Luke, where a 12-year-old Jesus gets lost in the temple and impresses the teachers with his wisdom. Beyond that, the silent years are a complete mystery to most of the world. But the Ethiopian Bible and its surrounding traditions don't leave those years blank. They fill them with stories that are, quite frankly, startling to a modern ear. One of the most provocative texts associated with this tradition is the infancy gospel of Thomas. While not always bound in every single physical manuscript, its stories are woven into the fabric of the Ethiopian understanding of the young Messiah. This isn't the meek and mild Jesus of Victorian Sunday school posters. This is a child with the raw, unchecked power of the creator of the universe, learning how to inhabit a human body and navigate human emotions. In these accounts, the young Jesus is depicted as a figure of immense and sometimes terrifying authority. One famous story describes him fashioning 12 sparrows out of clay on the Sabbath. When a neighbor complains that he is breaking the law by working on the holy day, the young Jesus simply claps his hands and commands the clay birds to fly. They take wing and soar away, chirping. It's a beautiful image of life-giving power. But the stories take a darker, more visceral turn that fits perfectly with the uncut version of history Mel Gibson often explores. There are accounts of the young Jesus striking a boy dead for accidentally bumping into his shoulder in the street or blinding those who spoke against his parents. Now, for many Westerners, these stories feel wrong. We want our Jesus to be perfectly composed from day one. But the Ethiopian tradition offers a more complex, high-stakes theology. It suggests that Jesus didn't just pretend to be a child, he truly was one. He had to grow in wisdom and stature, as the Bible says. These stories depict the struggle of a divine being possessing infinite power while still having the impulsive nature of a toddler. They show a God who has to learn the weight of his own hand. Eventually, in these texts, Jesus uses his power to resurrect the very people he struck down, showing a transition from raw power to redemptive grace. But the inclusion of these rough edges is vital. It challenges the sanitized Hallmark Channel version of Christianity that has dominated the West for centuries. It presents a Christ who is more ancient, more elemental, and much more dangerous. Why would the Western Church want these stories gone? Primarily because they are difficult to manage. They don't fit into a neat, systematic theology where everything is polished and predictable. They make Jesus look too human in his temper and too godlike in his casual manipulation of reality. But for the Ethiopian monks, these stories emphasize the absolute divinity of Christ from the moment of his conception. They didn't need a perfectly behaved child to prove Jesus was God. They saw his raw power as proof enough. For a filmmaker like Gibson, who thrives on showing the humanity of the divine, these stories are a goldmine. They suggest that the silent years weren't silent at all. They were a period of supernatural intensity that the world wasn't ready to handle. If you want to understand the man who stood before Pilate and said his kingdom was not of this world, you have to understand the child who could breathe life into clay and command the atoms of the earth before he could even tie his own sandals. This raw, unfiltered power wasn't just found in the person of Jesus, it was also contained within a physical object that Ethiopia claims to have guarded for 3,000 years. The Ark of the Covenant, Ethiopia's greatest claim. If you want to understand why the Ethiopian Bible feels like it has more weight than its Western counterparts, you have to look at what sits behind a heavy curtain in the city of Axum. In the West, the Ark of the Covenant is a cinematic prop from an Indiana Jones movie, a lost relic of a bygone age. But in Ethiopia, the Ark is not lost. They claim to have the physical gold-plated chest that held the Ten Commandments. And this belief is the bedrock of their entire national identity. It is the grand narrative that ties their 81-book Bible together. According to the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, another vital text that isn't in the Western Bible but is central to Ethiopian history, the Ark was brought to Ethiopia by Menelik I. He was the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The story goes that after Menelik visited his father in Jerusalem, he returned to Ethiopia, and the Ark traveled with him, protected by the divine will of God. While Western historians often dismiss this as legend, the Ethiopian people have guarded this secret with their lives for 3 millennia. This connection to the Old Testament is why the Ethiopian Bible is so much more extensive. They don't see the Old and New Testaments as two separate books. They see them as one continuous, unfolding legal and spiritual document. To them, the side of Jesus that people don't know is his literal, physical lineage to the Ethiopian throne. If Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, then the Ethiopian emperors believed they were his cousins. This changes the way you read the Gospel. When Jesus speaks about the Queen of the South rising up to judge the generation, Ethiopian believers see that as a direct reference to the Queen of Sheba. When the Bible mentions that Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God, they don't see it as a vague prophecy, they see it as a historical fact. For Mel Gibson, a director obsessed with the blood and soil of religious history, this creates a fascinating bridge. It's a version of Christianity that isn't just an abstract philosophy, it's tied to a physical place, a physical lineage, and a physical object of immense power. The Ark is kept in the chapel of the tablet at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. Only one person is allowed to see it, a single monk known as the Guardian of the Ark, who never leaves the chapel grounds until he dies. He spends his life in the presence of what he believes is the literal throne of God on earth. This level of intense, localized devotion is what has kept the Ethiopian Bible so pure. They weren't just protecting a book, they were protecting the manual for the Ark itself. If the Ark is real, and the absolute conviction of millions of Ethiopians suggests they certainly believe it is, then the 81-book Bible is the only version of the story that includes the full context of its journey. The Western world simplified the story and, in the process, lost the thread of where the most powerful object in human history actually went. The Ethiopian Bible isn't just about what Jesus said. It's about the massive, ancient infrastructure of holiness that prepared the way for him. But this brings us to a darker realization. If this information was preserved so carefully in Africa, why was it so aggressively scrubbed from the rest of the world? Censorship or preservation, the politics of the canon. History is written by the winners, but theology is often written by the emperors. To understand why your Bible is shorter than the Ethiopian one, we have to look at the power dynamics of the 4th and 5th centuries. The Roman Empire was a massive, sprawling beast that was beginning to crack. When Constantine the Great legalized Christianity, he wasn't just doing it out of the goodness of his heart. He needed a universal faith to act as the glue for a dying empire. But there was a problem. Early Christianity was a mess of different books, different gospels, and different ideas. In the East, they were reading Enoch. In the West, they were arguing over the nature of Christ's divinity. To keep the empire together, the church had to standardize. This led to the great councils like Nicaea and Laodicea, where bishops gathered to vote on what was in and what was out. The criteria for what stayed in the Western Bible were often practical. If a book was too difficult to translate, or if it gave too much power to the individual rather than the church hierarchy, it was often sidelined. The Book of Enoch, for example, describes a direct visionary experience with God that doesn't necessarily require a priest or a bishop as a middleman. That's a dangerous idea if you're trying to build a centralized religious bureaucracy. Ethiopia, however, was in a unique position. It was a Christian superpower in its own right, but it was geographically isolated by the walls of the Blue Nile and the Simeon Mountains. They didn't have to bow to Roman decrees, while the Roman Church was busy cleaning up the Bible to make it fit for an imperial state. The Ethiopian Church was simply adding to their library. They viewed the scriptures as a growing, living body of work. If a book was holy and ancient, why would you throw it away? This is where the term censorship comes into play. From a Western perspective, the missing books were removed to ensure theological purity. But from an Ethiopian perspective, that looks like a massive act of cultural theft. They see the Western Bible as a shortened version, a SparkNotes edition of the divine word. They preserved what the rest of the world was taught to fear. For someone like Mel Gibson, who has often expressed a deep skepticism of modern institutions and official narratives, the Ethiopian Bible represents the ultimate counter-history. It is proof that a massive chunk of our spiritual heritage was edited for political convenience. When we look at the side of Jesus that Ethiopia reveals, we are looking at a version of the faith that hasn't been filtered through the lens of European power. It's raw, it's African, and it's arguably more authentic to the world Jesus actually lived in. So, when we strip away the Roman edits and look at the full 81-book collection, what kind of Messiah actually emerges from the pages? A more human or more divine Jesus? When we piece together the 81-book canon, the figure that emerges isn't the soft, ethereal Messiah of European Renaissance art. The Jesus of the Ethiopian Bible is a paradox. He is simultaneously more human in his raw, visceral emotions and more divine in his cosmic authority. In the West, we've spent centuries trying to make Jesus relatable, often stripping away the terrifying scale of his power to make him a moral teacher. But the Ethiopian texts, enriched by the Book of Enoch and the Infancy Gospels, present a Christ who is the commander of the Watchers and the architect of the elements. This version of Jesus doesn't just offer parables, he offers a roadmap to a universe teeming with spiritual warfare. He is the Lion of Judah in a literal, ancestral sense, tied to a bloodline that guarded the Ark of the Covenant. For someone like Mel Gibson, this is the ultimate uncut version. It reflects a Messiah who isn't just a victim of Rome, but a cosmic revolutionary reclaiming a world that had been hijacked by fallen celestial powers. Ultimately, the Ethiopian Bible asks us a haunting question. Did we shorten the Bible to make God easier to understand or easier to ignore? By including the missing 21 books, the Ethiopian tradition refuses to sanitize the supernatural. It gives us a Jesus who is ancient, elemental, and arguably more authentic to the world he actually walked. It's a side of Christ that requires more than just faith. It requires a total reimagining of our history. Whether you view these texts as literal truth or historical curiosity, one thing is certain: the story doesn't end at 66 books. The uncensored gospel has been waiting in the highlands for 1,500 years. The only question is, are we finally ready to read it? If this ancient history changed the way you see the Messiah, hit subscribe and join us as we uncover the truths they tried to bury.